are taking a. Oh, we got the recording. Great, excellent. So yeah, the class is about patterning Mokume, not fusing it. And fusing is a very technical procedure that, you have to do the sort of steps in a certain row and a certain, skill level, or the billet falls apart. So it's a little stressful and it's time consuming. And if you get into Mokume, patterning Mokume, and you decide you really like it, then fusing is probably going to be in your future. You're going to learn how to fuse at some point. But I like to use the analogy of whoever, when you first sat down to make some jewelry or make a vessel or your first metals project, did your instructor start by handing you a bunch of scrap metal that you were going to melt down and alloy and forge, and then use the rolling mill to get the sheet and the wire that you needed to create your project? Or did you order your sheet and wire from Rio Grande? So if you ordered your sheet and wire from Rio Grande, that's kind of where we are here. We're ordering our Mokume already fused and layered, but there's no pattern in it. So we're really starting at the point where we put the pattern in, which is the artistic part of Mokume Gane. So that's what I like to tell people. First off, we are skipping a laborious part that is not really that creative, and we're jumping straight into the artistic part of Mokume Gane. And so there are lots of different ways to pattern Mokume Gane. I'm excited about this class because it marries two different ways to pattern, one of which, the stamp patterning, is one of the easiest ways to pattern. It's very straightforward. You take the Mokume, it's about 1 millimeter thick. You push up with a stamp tool that creates a bump. You file off that bump, look at it from the front, and you'll see the pattern. I like to use the analogy of your stamp tool is like uplift, and then your file is like erosion. And through those processes together, you get to see the pattern. People really understand, once they do stamp patterning, what Mokume Gane is. Because if you are just looking at a sheet of Mokume Gane, I'm sorry, I don't have one right here, but something that's 1.4, 1.6 millimeters thick, I can tell you that there are 27 layers alternating copper brass, but you can't see them because they're each just a fraction of a millimeter thick. But when you actually do the patterning yourself, the bump up and then the file, and you look and turn it and look at that pattern, then the light starts to dawn. So that's a great introduction, first thing to do to pattern Mokume. I'm just muting you, Cheryl. Then we can go into more complex patterning, and we're going to jump from the stamp patterning to chisel patterning. And chisel patterning is the way that Japanese people pattern Mokume Gane. It's the way it was first patterned back in the 1600s, and it's the way I love to pattern. So it's done from the top down. It's going to kind of blow everybody's mind, but when we use the chisel, we're actually carving into the Mokume from the top. And then this process, the analogy I use is our chisel is like the river going through the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River going through the Grand Canyon. So we're carving a channel, and then I use a lot of silly analogies. People remember them that way. So now you've got this channel carved in. So, and now if we use the analogy of the Grand Canyon, it would be like if Godzilla came along and stamped the Grand Canyon down flat. So in our hammer will be the Godzilla. We're going to stamp that channel that we've carved. We're going to stamp it back flat so that the pattern is locked in. All of that will make a lot more sense when we've got the material and the tools and all of my visual materials in front of us. But that's just sort of a little introduction into how I talk about patterning Mokume and the types of patterning that you guys will do in the chisel class. Let's see, I do have some images to share, and we could do that. I'm going to say a couple things before I show some images, because otherwise I might forget. And I have them, this is the only way I remember things, scribble little lists. So if you're already in the class, go ahead and please buy your kit. right? You know you have to do that, right? You're just like waiting for the last minute. Okay. Because which is fine, but I'm the one that puts the kit together. And with this hybrid class, some of the kits I'll be bringing to Atlanta with me if you're attending online, if you're attending in person. But if you're attending virtually, then I need to get your kit mailed to you so it arrives in time for you. And there's a link on the MAG website to order that kit. Another thing, and you guys can ask me questions about this later once I'm done showing images. You can jot your questions down, right? And we'll get them answered.
I do want to ask you one question, and just if you don't mind, can you tell? I'm assuming most of these folks know what it is. There may be some that don't. Can you tell us what it is, where it originates?
Oh, sure. Back up one little bit. Sure. So, and actually, Nell, I will do that when I show some images in just a second. Okay. I think it'll work. I think it'll make more sense if I say it when I'm showing the images rather than just being a talking head. So one little just other housekeeping thing was, if you're attending in person and you own a pitch bowl, let MAG know that you're going to bring it, if you can bring your pitch bowl, because the chiseling is a lot more fun to do on pitch. And if we have that, and also if you're attending online, know that if you have a pitch bowl, that's great. So they're just some things that I wanted to ask you to tell you guys about. Okay, so what is Mokume Gane? I mean, I answer that question all the time, and it always comes out a little bit differently, depending on what sort of images I use to show. So let's look at this. So can you all see my screen showing a strange object that some of you might know as a suba? Somebody nod for me. Dale, you see the suba? Okay, good. I can only see like 3 of you on my screen, so I'm thankful that those of you that are there looking, I can talk to. Okay, so Mokume Gane was invented in the 1600s, and it, first of all, should be, I should say, is that it's a technique, not a material. You can make Mokume Gane with lots of different materials. You just want to make sure that they're different colors, different metals. So for instance, copper and silver is a very traditional, copper and fine silver is a very traditional Japanese layer stack, copper, silver, like 27 layers, and because it has good color contrast. Other metals might not have as good color contrast, so it's not as good of an idea to stack them. But whatever you stack it up and you fuse it with time, heat, and pressure, but no solder. So that's the tricky part. And that's what the Japanese first started doing in the 1600s. And what they were doing back in the 1600s, let's see, I think I'm going to skip around. I'll come back to that slide, but I'm going to go back to I'm going to start with some more historical ones first. So this is an Edo period Suba. And so Suba, what is that? It's what Mokume was first it was what Mokume was first used for. Subas are sword guards. So if you can imagine this little center hole right here is where the sword goes in, and it's all stacked up together. So you've got the handle at one side, the sword guard, and then the blade. And the idea is the sword guard is physically what keeps the enemy's sword from coming down all the way down and getting your hand. All right. So that's its practical purpose. But of course, in the Edo period in Japan, it was elevated to a hugely a decorative art form. They didn't really do jewelry. They did sword furniture. So these beautiful, elaborate sword guards that you never saw combat. They were just decorations on the samurai's sword on his belt for everyone to see how fancy he was, that he had the best suba and the fanciest materials. So this particular suba, you can really see the Mokume Gane. This would be copper and shakudo. The black is the shakudo and the copper is the red. And so that was its first use, and it basically it came from the use, of course, of Damascus steel in the swords themselves. That was a practical thing, and it would take a long time to go into why the folding and the different patterns in the steel. But basically the Japanese looked at that and saw, what if we do that specifically with different colored non-ferrous metals and use that as a decorative element? So first done in the 1600s, really raised to a huge art form in the 1800s, which is the Edo period. And then really kind of went out of fashion. And well, Japan went through some serious stuff, right? At the end of the Edo period. And then of course, later in the during the Second World War. So the number of practitioners of Mokume Gane in Japan plummeted to just about zero. But there's one specific fellow, Mr. Norio Tamagawa, that helped bring the technique back from the dead, really. He studied old books in his university, in Gidai University in Tokyo, and really learned how to do mokume again. And he taught Hiroko Sato, who married Jean Pijanowski, and Jean and Hiroko came to the US and started teaching this technique at art schools around the US. So that's a sort of just a real summary of how what happened with the technique from the 1600s all the way into present day here in the US. Little historical of some of Mr. Tamagawa's work. So his vases are often like a foot high. So he's in his 70s and he still raises vessels. He sells, he'll make like 3 a year, and they're asking prices like $30,000-$40,000. And they're just amazing. All chisel patterned. Okay, so bringing it back to technique, bringing it back to what we're going to be doing. One of the advantages of chisel patterning is that you can start doing it at any thickness. With stamp patterning, it has to be only about 1.1 millimeter to 1.5 millimeters. You can't really do it much thicker than that because you can't actually push the metal up. So we'll go into that in much more detail when I'm actually teaching the class. Let's see what other historical examples. Just in terms of inspiration, this is a modern day mokume maker, Ruhei Saka, which I'm mispronouncing terribly, I'm sure. His work is just mind blowing. The control that he has over the planning out what he's making while he's making the billet. So the number of layers and the stacking order, he takes that, he knows what the end product is going to be, what he wants back when he's stacking the metal up. And then his control over the chisel is just flawless.
That kind of reminds me of, like if you go to the Florence, one of those museums anyway, they got the big marble blocks that aren't completely carved, but you just see the figures emerging from the marble.
Yeah.
It takes a lot to be able to see and plan ahead.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that keeps me interested in mokume. I am easily bored, and so I will wander off from technique to technique. But when I found mokume, full stop. I mean, it is not boring, because the first time you pattern mokume, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. We can come back to photos later if we want. But the first time you pattern mokume, I wanted to encourage you guys that you're going to love it, whatever the pattern is, because you'll be like, oh my God, I made a pattern appear from a blank sheet. It's like magic. It's only later in the process you start to get pickier. You're like, I want this pattern, and I want this number of layers showing, and I want my end piece, once it's patterned, I want it to be X amount of thickness and X big, so I can make a vessel or a box lid, or I want it to be only 0.5 millimeter. And so I have to plan the pattern, because I want to make earrings, so I got to plan the pattern accordingly, that it'll look, that I can keep rolling or forging to get it to 0.5 millimeter without making the pattern too thin and spread out. It's endlessly fascinating in terms of figuring out the spatial requirements. How many layers, how dense should the pattern be? What's the final patina? So that's another whole thing that we are going to cover in the class is what patina should I use at the end to make the layers stand out and look good, and what kind of finish do I put on, what do I sand it with, how do I polish it, how do I protect it at the end? All these questions we will address, and I will lead you. This is a little riff of a quote from one of my mentors, Fort Hallam. When I first took the class with him, he had us all enraptured with his, talk of the Edo period and the samurai warriors and all this. And he said, in this class, I will be leading you on the path. The path will be going up into the mountains, and it's sharp, jagged on both sides, and there's mist, and just follow me. Because when you go off to one side, you go off to the other side, is disaster. I know the road. And so we'll go down that road, and I'll take you, to the top of the mountain, and it'll be great. And that's the thing, is that when you have a guide that can say, oh yeah, no, we're not doing that today. Just do this. Trust me. Then you can create a finished piece or create a finished pattern that's beautiful, and you don't even know what you didn't do. Right. But that's the fun of it, is that then it's your job to try it again later without my guidance and see how it goes. And I will say I'm very responsive to folks that have questions later. So if you take my class and then you repeat it again later and you're like, whoa, this is not doing what it did in the class, you just email me, and I'm happy to talk to you about to answer your questions. So
I might add that basically, since it is a virtual and a live class, the virtual class, of course, will be recorded, and it is available for 30 days on our Facebook page for you to log back in and review it if you'd like to. If you missed it.
That's great. Yeah, and I found that to be a really valuable tool. I since COVID, of course, I've started teaching online, and there are goods and bads about teaching online, but one of the goods is definitely the ability to rewind and watch demos again, and also have like the best seat in the house with the cameras for the demos. So yeah, I think that's and this actually will be my first hybrid class. I teach in-person workshops and I teach online, but I've never done the two together. So I'm excited about that. I think it will give a feeling of immediacy and community that is sometimes hard to have in a just online class. So yeah, looking forward to it. I think maybe now I'd be happy to open it up to questions. And see, let's see well, first off, can I ask you guys a question? And if you don't have your camera on, maybe you can put your answer in the chat, or there's something I think you can poke. Who is bringing who here is registered for the class? I'm just curious. Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3 that have their on. That's good. Okay. And well, if you're on the fence, certainly I'd be curious to have you let me know if I can answer any questions about the class. And then yeah, then let's see, I see the chat. I see a few things have come through chat. I'll just open that up to see. Okay. All right. Yeah. So does anyone have any questions for me? You can, if you're too shy just to unmute, you can type them in the chat.
You can type it or just unmute yourself and ask your question. Oh, come on, folks, don't be shy.
Oh, I know I'm shy. I have to, it just takes a little bit of encouragement sometimes. While people are thinking about whether they want to say something. And if you unmute, then we'll know you're interested in saying something.
Moon says, how do you order the kit? Well, Scott, basically, when you register, there's going to be a place that tells you about the supplies and materials that are necessary for the class, and the information on ordering the kit is there.
Mm-hmm.
Chapin Diamond wants to know, what is your favorite metal combination?
Chapin, that's like having me to say what my favorite child is, I could say like right now, I mean, probably it's still sterling silver and copper. I had a little time where I was enamored of the base metal combinations of like copper nickel. Copper nickel is intriguing because the bond is so strong. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff with it, like hammer it on the end grain and roll it on the end grain. I mean, just really crazy stuff. And so that's fun. But when it comes right down to it, uh, longevity is important, and what's going to happen to the piece as it ages. And when it's base metal to base metal, they just tend to get dull together. So, the copper and brass is pretty good, really. It'll stay black and yellow. But over time, it's just difficult to keep that much contrast. So I really am liking at least silver and silver and copper. It's just it's traditional, but it's really great. Oh, okay. That's great to ask. Oh, and Cynthia is registered. That's great. Okay.
And Martha Lorentos has given us a link directly to the class, and that's where you can find like the registration information and also the kits. Okay. And someone asked, Scott Boone asked, can you use niobium as one of the metals?
One can, but it is quite tricky. We're not going. Oh well, and we're not fusing in this particular class, but yeah, I mean, this fellow Ian Ferguson wrote a book. He did all the different types of metals, and he fused like copper to niobium. And yes, you certainly can do that, but the working properties of the metals are so different that certainly if I was going to be making niobium mokume, I would be tooling up completely differently. So niobium needs to be a really high temperature. You need to keep the oxygen away from it whenever you're annealing it. And so yes, you can, but I wouldn't with the types of mokume that I make. Niobium is almost more, I would say, on the end of working with steel or stainless steel, so that you're fusing it almost more like Damascus steel than you are mokume. It's kind of a gray area whether is it Damascus steel or is it mokume, because specifically stainless Damascus is very similar in process to making mokume, and in some ways you could say it's a subset of mokume, because mokume technically is whatever metals layered together, but in practice, we generally consider like the non-ferrous metals to be mokume and the ferrous metals to be Damascus steel. And niobium, of course, doesn't have steel, doesn't have iron in it, but its working properties are so much more like steel because it's a harder and higher melting. That's why I'm lumping it in with that. So that's an interesting question, though.
And you mentioned 27 layers and your favorite silver, copper, and so forth. And I know from reading and listening to you that you're typically only cutting through about a third of that. So I'm wondering, why don't we use a thicker, say, copper element on the back, since we're only cutting through a third?
That's a very good question. And it has to do with the physical properties of the metals as you finish the fusing process. So because I've been right there, Dale, I've been like, well, I'm not going to use all that silver or all that shibuichi. I'm going to just put a big chunk of something in the middle that I don't care about, because I'm never going to see that, or on one side. But in the fusing and the forging process, the stresses on the metal are quite different, because you've got a chunk of whatever it is. If it's a chunk of copper, it's going to squish out a lot more. And so you'll get your top layers staying tight, and the copper layer squishing out as you're forging it. And then when you go to roll it, there's a lot of stress between that changeover, the different layers, and then the thick chunk of whatever it is. And you may get a delam there. At the very least, your metal is going to curl and hug itself around one of the rolling mill rollers. So it can be a little bit of a hassle. What I have done in the past, and I will do more of, is that so say you just top layers is something fancy, the middle you don't care about. I'll make my silver layers really thin, and then so you can go to like 24 gauge silver and then 16 gauge copper or 14 gauge copper, and just do that in the middle. So that at least you're cutting down the amount of silver that you're using. So that's one thing you can do. And also doing that chunk in the middle rather than on one side, so that you don't have the roller thing happening to the metal, the end. But if you do the copper chunk in the middle too thick, then the tops and the bottoms that are all stripy and the layers that you want, when you go to squish them, they might do that, so that you've now got like a sandwich that's slipped. And that's I speak from experience on that. And so yeah, you try to get fancy and then disaster strikes. That's what happens.
Thank you.
Sure. And that's all, people instantly want to get into the weeds of the fusing because it's really interesting. And of course, I do still recommend you try patterning Mokume and then working with it, fabricating it to make a finished piece before you decide if you love Mokume. Then if you know that you love Mokume, then you might want to go back and learn the fusing. I'm teaching fusing only twice next year. I'm done teaching it this year. I'm only teaching it only twice next year. One of them is already full. And Dale, I saw what you did. I'm so pleased. Thank you for signing up. I've taught Dale quite a few classes online, and we hang out together at our weekly or bi-weekly sawing circle, but we've never met in person. So I'm so pleased that you'll be coming down. So anyway, the fusing class in February is full, but I'll be teaching at Metalworks in August, and that will include fusing. So August 14, 18 of 2024 is the only other time I'll be teaching fusing, if you're thinking that sounds interesting. Okay. Any other questions?
Hi, this is Katie. I'm from Frederick, Maryland. When you're fusing the billets, are you using a kiln or?
Sure. Yes. I'm going to go ahead, and you can unmute yourself again if you want, Candy, but I was hearing the football score in the back. At least I'm not sure quite what it was. Yeah, when I'm teaching fusing, I'm teaching with the kiln, with the electric kiln method, because it's the most reliable. And also in my own personal studio, that's the best way for me to be fusing. But I did learn my fusing in a different way. I learned it using a propane fired forge, and forging it down much more similarly to how the Japanese did it hundreds of years ago. But then I transitioned to using the electric kiln because it's a little more reliable. Okay. All right. I see a question from Chapin. Oh, that's coming down after chiseling. Oh, okay, or rolling. So Chapin's asking, we got to I was using the analogy earlier about carving. Your chisel is carving like the river, like the Colorado River, and now you've got these dents. And then how do we be the Godzilla? How do we flatten it back down? And almost always we forge with the hammer first before we roll. And that is because the idea is we want to take our metal that's got thick spots and low spots where the pattern is, and we want to get it back flat, all one thickness. How do we do that? You might be thinking, well, I've got this rolling mill over here, and it's a lot easier because now I don't have to hammer. But the problem with the rolling mill is that it's a shear force. It's pulling the metal apart, and you can actually just rip the metal apart when it gets to the thin spot. Because if you know, like if you have ever made a cuff bracelet and there's a thin spot, a weak spot in your cuff bracelet, and you go to bend it, and it's right there. That's where it bends, right? The thin spot. So it's the same sort of thing. If you have a weak spot, which you will with your Mokume after you've patterned it, because it's got the thicks and thins, if you send it through the mill, it could rip where those low points are. So the forging hammer is much gentler because you're actually pushing the metal down. You can think of it like a piece of clay in your thumb. You're actually just pushing the metal down so it goes in, and the high spots are lowered. And actually the low spots get thicker because metal really does act like clay. So you almost always use you almost always forge it down with a hammer before you roll it. And be getting into that. One neat part of this class that I haven't taught before, if any of you have taken my chiseling classes and think, well, she's already taught me chiseling. Well, the fun part about this class is that we're going to be chiseling different thicknesses of metal. Usually when I teach chiseling, we just chiseling 14 gauge metal, but actually that's not very Japanese of me. In Japan, they usually start patterning thicker, like 3 millimeters thick. So we're going to do some of that in this class. We're going to chisel some 3 millimeter thick material, and it's very different. The effect is quite different. It takes longer, so that's why I don't generally do it, because you're going to be chiseling more than once. The first time you chisel on 3 millimeter thick mokume, you're not going to get as much pattern. But what you do is you chisel, you forge, you roll, you chisel again in that same pattern, and then do it again, and then you'll forge and roll again, and you get a real different effect that way. And then the other thing I'll be teaching in this class that I have not taught online before is actually making the chisels, because you can't just go buy a chisel. You have to make your chisel, and so I haven't really taught that online before, because I find it just haven't gotten to it, but I'm going to get to it in this class. So there will be a lot of new things. So let's look at what Cheryl just asked. Will the cherry blossom pattern be available as one of the stamps? In the class. Well, the problem, Cheryl, is that this type of stamp patterning, the stamp patterning that we're doing, you can't do the cherry blossom with. It doesn't work. Because the stamp patterning is pushing up from underneath, and so the precision of the stamp is not precise. So we could use a cherry blossom shaped petal shape and push up in our metal, but it's just going to be kind of a lump. It's not going to look much different than a round one. So there would be no point in using a cherry blossom. Yeah, the cherry blossom pattern is very specific, and not something that we're going to cover in this class, because I can't cover everything. Yeah.
So, Anne, is there do you have any of your work that you could show us?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I realize yeah, I mean, they're all in here. I just didn't want to overwhelm people with a bunch of images and not show anything else. Let's see.
Anybody?
So let's see. I have a bunch. We could start. Well, this will be a fun one to show. So this is a piece, and I'll show the close-up as well. Here's a close-up of this piece. This is chisel patterned and then stamp patterned after the chisel patterning. So I know that I'm going to be having a range of experience levels in this class, from people who have never done Mokume before to some of my repeat offenders, I call you guys, and so who I dearly love and appreciate. So those of you that have been doing Mokume patterning with me for a while, I might direct you to try something like this, where I won't just, I can't go into complete detail in how this is done, but the chisel patterning is done first, and then the stamp patterning is done afterwards. So the chisel patterning is the area right through here. There's no stamping in this area, but in this area here, additional stamp patterning has been done afterwards. So that's fun. This is a box called Drifting. I made this in early 2020, right before the world fell apart. And it actually was I was trying to get into a competition in Japan, and it didn't make it in the competition. And I was very disappointed because it was the last time I could enter this competition. It was for young craftspeople, which in Japan means anyone under 50 or 50 and under. And so I was very excited to be able to, at the age of 49 or 50, enter the young people's competition. So I did not get into the competition, but when I finished it, I put it up on my website and on Instagram, and it was bought by a private collector right from my Instagram page. So I was very pleased about that. See, here's a tea container that is actually done with chisel patterning, and then a lot of fabrication. So some of the challenges with Mokume are what to do with it after you've got a good pattern. And so now you've got a piece of metal that might be 18 gauge thick, maybe it's 20 gauge, maybe it's a 2x6, and then what do you do with it? So I will be covering that, talking about that in the workshop of how to fabricate with it and keep the pattern and not destroy it. You basically you need to keep the temperature low. You can only use easy and medium solder, or the pattern could melt into itself, basically. Here's the inside of the tea container. And let's see what else. Oh, I would so let's go back to I showed this piece briefly, and then I switched to a different piece to describe what a sword guard is, because I didn't want to get sidetracked into talking about the cherry blossom pattern. But since Cheryl mentioned it, we might as well talk about the cherry blossom pattern, because it's something that I did recently. So this piece was made in the 1800s by Takahashi Okitsugu, and this pattern, it's not easy to see, but this pattern right in through here, the little cherry blossoms, no one had really done that pattern. No one was really sure how that pattern was done since this fellow made this tsuba in the 1800s. There was a fellow who wrote a book that I'm tempted to go find a copy of it, because his name has escaped me right now, but a Japanese fellow wrote a book on Mokume Gane, and he did some research into how this was done, and he did some good samples, but he never made a tsuba with this pattern. And so that was my challenge. I was really interested in figuring that out. And first I did this little box. I did a cherry blossom pattern and made this little box, and that went well. Well, it was a sample, and then I was like, well, I want to do something with the piece, so I made a little box. But then I went ahead and made a tsuba with the cherry blossom pattern, and this was quite an undertaking, and came out rather well. And Dale, do you see the edge here and how you can see the lines of the Mokume? The reason that you're actually able to see the lines on that scale is that those copper layers were like 3 times as thick, I think, as normal layers, and then the brass was real thin. I just wanted to get I wanted you to be able to see the pattern on the side, even though this Mokume has a ton of layers. They couldn't stay the same thickness all the way through, or they'd be too small to see on the side. So for the middle, I switched to thick, thin, so that you could actually see the layers, because it's fun, you know. I also used 1 millimeter thick nickel as my top layer. That's what the cherry blossoms are. And when I was chiseling, it was just a lot of, let's just say, a lot of work to get rid of all of the top nickel layer, because I didn't want you to see it as the rest of the pattern. I just wanted the cherry blossoms to be nickel, and of course the random petals as well. So I had to do a lot of chiseling to get rid of the rest of the top nickel layer. So this piece went to Japan. I entered it in another competition, and this time I'm so pleased to say that it did get in. And this is a letter that I got telling me of my award I got in the competition and won their bronze award. And then the image is of the judges. So the competition was basically a sword and sword furniture competition. I really felt like I was in a very different land. I didn't go to the competition. I didn't go to Japan, just my Suba did. But yeah, very, very, very different world. And it's very honored that my piece was accepted in this competition. Let's see, other work I could show. This is also chisel patterned, a little box. And here is another chisel patterned vase. When this little guy just sold, which I'm pleased. It's so funny. My rings are things I make to make a living, and they're skillful. You know, it's difficult to make them, but they're not really art, I would say, because they're, you know, it's a craft. But when I make my vessels, they're really individual expressions and one-of-a-kind pieces. And I was quite proud of this little box. The patterning on the top is Mokume. The side walls are just sterling silver with some chisel engraving on the side. But I could certainly show how to do this pattern in the class. It's basically a crosshatch pattern meant to look like thatching. So yeah, let's see, I'm going to go to the chat window and see who's Masaki Takahashi. Yes, that's right, Scott. That's the name of the fellow who wrote basically the text. I think the title of it is actually the textbook of Mokume Gane. And so if you look at the chat, folks, and take down that name, Masaki Takahashi, you can get his book on Amazon in English now, which is really exciting. For a good while, it was only available in Japanese, but now it's been translated into English, and it's extremely useful book. So
I have a question, Anne. When you're making a ring, is that a different technique of the Mokume Gane, or is it like what we're doing?
In some ways it's different because it's done with twist patterning, and we're not doing any twist patterning in this class. Because, you know, again, there's so many different ways to pattern. But yeah, it's definitely starts the same way with the fusing. And then, but instead of sheet, you use rod. So we're using mostly 14 gauge sheet, but with the rings, I start with 6mm square rod. And let's see, I'm going to stop the share again and ask if there are any other questions. And if, I could say I have more images, and maybe you guys can vote on which, unless there are other questions, because I would always, you know, use that time that we have here live because you can look up these images at another time. But if we don't have more questions, then I could show images that are more process images and what the chisels look like, or I could show pictures of my rings. And which would you guys rather see? Dale says the first one is one. Okay, one is like the process one. Yeah, or you can hold up a 2 if you want to see the rings. You can do that, or you can stick your preference in the chat. I'm seeing some 2s. I love it. They're like peace signs. Okay. I'm seeing some 1s. I'm seeing more 1s. I am seeing more 1s than 2s. So that's fun because, you know, I spend a lot of time looking at pictures of my rings, and I don't need to. A lot of time looking at my rings. I do love making the rings, and I'm grateful to the clients that I make rings for. But sometimes I feel a little bit like those of you that are my age or older will get this reference, the Lucy in the Chocolate Factory. She's got like the conveyor belt, and she has to wrap up each chocolate as it goes by, and the conveyor belt starts going by, and it's going by so fast that pretty soon she's got little chocolates everywhere. Anyway, so yeah, okay. Any other questions? Well, you can be thinking about questions while I go to some of the process picks. Where did oh, here's a fun thing. Let's see if this works. I'm not sure if this will work. This is a little QuickTime video that just shows me chiseling. Can you guys see the video? Is that working? It's time lapse. It does take a little bit longer than this. But that just shows the pitch bowl setup. And you can also probably catch when I first put the chisel in, it's at a higher angle. And then as I'm chiseling along, it's a different angle. And then when I'm all done, it goes a little bit lower as it goes out. I'll show you some still images of what I mean in a second. But that that piece that I'm chiseling right there, it turned into the tea container.
Oh,
So it's, and I made 2 of these to turn in, and each of them turned into 2 of the sides of the tea container. Let's see, so let's close that. I think I have to stop the share and then share again, otherwise I'll get confused. I wonder which one. Oh yeah, I think this is.
all right. There's a question about whether you can use gravers as well.
Gravers, you can use them, but they're not going to take the material off, as much material off as you need to. I did actually have a student that signed up for one of my online classes, and she's in Canada, and we both underestimated how pathetic the Canadian Postal Service was, and she didn't get her kit on the first. She didn't have her kit for the first day of the class, but she had engraving tools, so she had some gravers, and she did actually make a neat piece. But the gravers are so little that they're not built to go as deep as the chisels are. So so yeah, it's the same kind of thing. And Chapin, I know you're asking me what the angles are. I'm not going to tell you. I just don't do numbers like that. But I'm going to show you pictures, and then maybe you can tell me what the angle is. I know Chapin well, that's why I can tease him like that. So Scott asks about what pitch. I'm using Japanese pitch. You can use German pitch. You can use Italian pitch, the old kind, the bitch, the old stinky pitch. But you can really use any kind you want. But I use Japanese pitch, and I made it myself. But you can buy it from St. Charleston. Do you guys know him? I can look up it's like crazy spelling. Oh, I'm not going to try and do that now because I'll forget what I'm showing. Anyway, we can look that up later, but St. Charleston, he's based in Seattle, and I can't remember what his website is called. If any of you do know, look it up for me and stick it in the chat. I'd be grateful. And he'll sell you.
Excuse me, you can also check out Dallas Vinson at MAG. We're fortunate enough to have sort of an in-house guy that's got all sorts of tools and can order just about anything you want or need. So just Dallas Vinson at MAG.
Okay. All right. Great. And yeah, or St. Charleston, I think he makes it himself. And of course, if you have a friend in Japan, you could have them buy some and mail it to you. So let's see, I'm just showing some images here. These are actually still images from when I teach the chisel class online. So here I'm just showing a chisel and sort of the angle at which I would start. Oh, actually, it's one then the other. So you see this steeper angle at which I'm holding the chisel, that would be the starting angle. So I would need to dig into the metal to get the chisel to dig in and stay. And then I would start tapping it with my, a chasing hammer works great, but you can use a lot of different kinds of hammers to hammer on your chisel. And then as it catches, then more my sort of riding angle that I'm really, when I'm in the metal and going along, is more like that angle. Of course, this depends completely on the chisel that you're using. I'll try to make all of your chisels. That's the other thing, is that you got to order your kit so I know how many chisels I have to make. So they'll be about the same angle, but it depends on the curve of the belly. So the reason I can't give you a total answer, Chapin, is that the angle is a function of the top, but it's also a function of how much the belly curves on the bottom of the chisel. And the belly is what allows you to chisel forward and stay at the same depth. If it doesn't have a belly, it will just keep going down. And the only way to keep it going level would be to kind of rip the metal. So you have to have this really slight belly. And whenever I do it, it comes out a little bit different. So that's why, I'm not going to tell you the exact angle. But yeah, that's about the angle. And then here's, we can look at some chisels. So here's just a group of chisels. Again, this is an image I show in my online chisel class. They range from, here's these two are V chisels. Actually, these three are V chisels, right? You can see the point, and they just vary in their the angle, how deep or how shallow they are. The deeper they are, the easier they are to control, and so that's great for beginners. But the bad part of it is that you can go too deep easily. So a shallower chisel like so is a little harder to use, but you're less likely to go too deep into the material. And then a curved chisel like this one or this one here are even more difficult to use because they don't have the point as kind of a grounding to keep you stuck into the metal. So I don't tend to give people rounded chisels. I tend to give them the pointy V chisel, a shallow V chisel. Here's a close-up of a chisel shape that I like, right? And here's the same chisel, but a side view. And so you can see here's the face of the chisel. So that's the last thing that I filed to create it. And then this curve is like the belly.
Mhm.
And so for someone, I know it's funny, like my parents were computer engineers. Mokume requires a lot of spatial math in terms of how many layers, how thick should it be when I start patterning and all of that. But I'm not really that good at specific numbers. I'm really kind of dyslexic. And with angles, I get really confused about from where to where. So, so like from the ground to that, or, is it, so I'll be like, well, is it a a 60 degree or a 30 degree? I don't know. It's one of those because I'll get confused about the negative space versus the positive space. So I guess that's a dyslexic thing. So anyway, I don't do real hard numbers with the chisels much. I hope people will find that reassuring in some way. Let's see. Leslie says goodbye. Thanks. And Chapin says thanks. Sure. And yeah, I think that's good for that. That was it for the chisel images. So I'll go ahead and stop the share. And yeah, we've got a few minutes left.
Last chance for questions or just greetings or whatever you'd like to say. Everybody just wants to
Hey, Valerie.
I would just say for anybody who's on the fence, this is like it'll be 14th by November because there's a twisted class next month, right?
Right.
So
Right.
my 14th class with Anne, but my first one live with her.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to.
If you're on the fence about it, like I'll tell you, for me personally, the chisel technique is my favorite.
Excellent.
And so it's a lot of fun. So if you're thinking about it, do it.
Great. Thank you, Valerie. And I will say also, I often forget to plug myself, but Valerie mentioned the twist class I have coming up, and that is October. My calendar over here is still on August. I'm a little bit behind. October 7th and 8th. And it's just time. You have just time if you're interested in the twist class to sign up and get the kit. So you can see on my website. Here. I'm going to type my website in here. Actually, if you're in the class, you already know what the website is because you've
that
been there.
one's just on your site. It's virtual.
Yeah, it's an online class and it's a weekend and it's just, and well, those of you who have taken my online classes could attest to them, but I show images and short videos and I talk through them live. So it's quite interactive. We're all sitting here just like this, but I'm showing videos and people are asking questions and then we have work time as well. So it's really a fun. I really enjoy it. I do these. I have been doing like 4 of them a year, but I've had to drop down to about 2 per year because I'm doing a lot more in-person classes, which is great. And which I really love because there's so much more time to be spontaneous and interactive in the in-person classes. So I really enjoy
We're really excited that you're going to be with us November 4th through 6th at MAG. Not too late to sign up. Come visit Atlanta. Actually, it's a pretty good time of year to visit Atlanta. It's not, hot as Hades.
Good, good. All right. Any other-
So,
Nell, can I say something about our
oh, please.
show?
This is Joan Barnes. This is our vice president.
So I
Actually,
want
she
to
does
tell
everything.
everybody that we're having our annual jewelry show, and it is October the 21st in Atlanta, and it's going to be really cool. We have lots of fun things happening. We have Peppy Tools, who is doing a large demo area and bringing new tools that they're debuting. And Ani from Jewel Tool will be there demonstrating the Jewel Tool and demonstrating all her new things. So that's going to be, she's a show in herself. But the one thing that we're really excited about this year is that we have an online silent auction. And many of the people who are in the show artists, have donated a piece for the silent auction, as well as some people who have been instructors at MAG, such as Harold O'Connor has donated 3 pieces, which are to die for. Alex Boyd has donated a piece. Ryan Gardner has donated a piece. And so we're thinking our silent auction is actually going to debut like the 1st of October. So anybody from anywhere in the world can participate in the silent auction, and the proceeds from that silent auction will go towards moving expenses for MAG, because we're outgrowing our space and we're having to move next year. So we're very excited about that and want everyone who's in the Atlanta area to please come to the show on the 21st of October. We have some actual show artists in our group tonight, which is very exciting. We have some amazing people who are participating. And if you are not in the Atlanta area, please hop on the silent auction. There might be some things that you might want to grab. Thanks, Nell.
Thanks, Joan. All right. Well, I think that pretty much brings us to the hour. Thank you so much, Anne. We look forward to seeing you in Atlanta. Thank you to everybody that tuned in. It was wonderful to see everyone. So I'm just going to end it now. Good night.
Okay, I'll see y'all in November, I hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.